The Grand Axis Hall had hosted the death of empires and the birth of alliances, but it had never gone quiet the way it did the night the human walked in wearing dead men's steel. I remember the sound first, not the silence that came later, but the laughter. The deep, rolling, chest-shaking laughter of 100 delegates from 12 spacefaring civilizations, all aimed at one figure crossing the polished floor of the most important diplomatic chamber in the quadrant. I was laughing too. I wish I could say otherwise, but I am Valorian, and Valorians do not lie about their failures. That is why I am the one telling this story, because someone needs to understand what happened in that hall, and the truth only works if you start with the shame of it. My name is Kale Shureth. I am a tactical officer of the Valorian Combined Fleet, decorated in 3 campaigns, trained in 14 forms of combat doctrine. I was sent to Citadel Oranath as part of my government's delegation to the Coalition Summit. The purpose of the summit was simple and terrifying. The Asharan Tide, a devouring swarm intelligence that had already consumed 3 frontier civilizations, was pushing deeper into settled space. No single species could hold it. The mathematics were brutal and clear. If we did not combine our forces within the year, the tide would reach the inner systems, and everything we had built across 5,000 years of interstellar civilization would be dissolved into biological slurry and fed to a mindless hunger. So we gathered. 12 species, each one proud, each one powerful, each one convinced that they were the natural leader of any coalition. The Drathari arrived first, their delegation clad in liquid metal exosuits that shifted and reformed with every movement, silver rivers flowing across their bodies like living mercury. They were beautiful to watch, and they knew it. Commander Cephas led them, a tall and angular figure with a reputation for both brilliance and cruelty. The Korvathi came next, massive and armored in bone plate that grew from their own bodies and regenerated damage in real time. Their war champion, Gorath, stood nearly 3 meters tall and carried a graviton maul that could crack hull plating with a casual swing. He made sure everyone saw him lift it one-handed as he walked to his delegation's platform. The Morvasi arrived in crystalline battle shells that sang with harmonic resonance, refracting light into prismatic displays that dazzled the eye. Their technology was elegant and deadly. A Morvasi crystal blade could cut through starship armor like paper. The Thessari delegation wore phase-adaptive stealth weave that made them shimmer at the edges of perception. The Dren brought their neural-linked combat drones, hundreds of tiny machines orbiting their delegates like angry clouds of metallic insects. Each arrival was a performance. Each delegation walked to their platform with the confidence of a species that believed it was the center of the galaxy. The hall filled with the competitive energy of predators forced to share a watering hole. I stood on the Valorian platform in my phase weave armor, the finest tactical equipment my civilization produced, and I felt proud. We were ready. We were the best equipped, best trained force at the table, and everyone knew it. Then the announcement came through the hall's communication system, delivered in the neutral tone of the station's diplomatic protocol. Earth's representative had arrived. I remember the ripple of mild curiosity that passed through the delegations. Humanity was known to us, but not respected. They had achieved interstellar travel barely 3 centuries ago. Their territory was modest. Their fleet was functional but unremarkable. They had been invited to the coalition because the tide threatened their borders too, and because refusing any willing species would have been a diplomatic complication no one wanted. But no one expected them to contribute much. Most of us assumed they would send a squad of their augmented Marines, perhaps a dozen soldiers in their best equipment, enough to show willing participation without pretending to compete with the elder races. The doors at the far end of the Grand Axis Hall opened. A single figure walked through. He was tall for a human, but not by our standards. His build was solid and squared, the body of someone who had carried heavy things for a very long time. But it was not his size that caught attention. It was what he was wearing. Every other delegate in that hall gleamed. Polished alloys, energy-reactive surfaces, living materials, light-bending composites. The hall was a showcase of the finest military technology 12 civilizations could produce. And into the middle of it walked a man wearing armor that looked like it had been dragged through every war in the last century and then left in a salvage yard. The suit was a dull, scratched gray, not the sleek gunmetal of modern human military equipment I had seen in intelligence briefings, but a flat, battered gray, that had been scraped clean of any finish it once had. The chest plate was dented in 3 places, the deepest dent sitting directly over the heart, and the metal around it was warped from some massive impact that had nearly punched through. Scorch marks spiderwebbed across the left side in the distinct pattern of a close-range energy discharge. One pauldron, the right one, had cracked completely at some point and been fused back together with crude field welding, the seam visible as a raised ridge of mismatched alloy. The left gauntlet was a slightly different shade than the rest of the suit, clearly a replacement piece taken from another set entirely. The helmet visor had a long, deep scratch across it that must have impaired visibility through the left side. The knee joints were worn smooth from use, the protective caps gouged and scratched. He looked like a relic. He looked like something pulled from a battlefield museum and strapped onto a body that had not gotten the message that the war was over. The laughter started with the Korvathi. Gorath made a sound deep in his chest, a rumbling vibration that was his species' equivalent of open mockery. It spread from him to the delegates beside him, then jumped to the Drathari. Cephas did not laugh, but the thin smile on her angular face was worse than laughter. The Morvasi made musical sounds of amusement, their crystal shells chiming with the harmonic of derision. Within seconds, half the hall was laughing, and the other half was exchanging looks that said the same thing. Earth had sent a joke, a single soldier in falling apart armor. This was not a contribution to a galactic coalition. This was an insult, or a confession of irrelevance. I suppressed my own smirk. The Valorian officer in me was already performing the assessment. Old equipment, no visible advanced systems, no energy signature suggesting hidden technology, no backup squad, no support drones, no tactical AI escort. He was alone in junk armor. The tactical conclusion was immediate and damning. Earth had nothing worth sending. The human said nothing. He walked across the polished floor with a steady, unhurried stride, his boots leaving faint scuff marks on the surface. He did not look left or right at the delegates on their elevated platforms. He did not acknowledge the laughter. He walked to the empty human delegation platform, the smallest in the hall, positioned at the very edge of the assembly, and he stepped up onto it and stood there, hands at his sides, helmet still on, silent. The laughter continued for another 10 seconds, and then began to fade, not because anyone decided to stop, but because the human silence made it strange. Mockery works when the target reacts. When they flush, or bristle, or stammer excuses, the laughter feeds on itself and grows. But this man gave it nothing. He stood on his platform like a pillar of scarred metal and offered no response at all. The laughter lost its fuel and died into an awkward quiet that was somehow worse. I noticed something then that I could not explain. His breathing had not changed. I was close enough to the human platform to read the faint rise and fall of his chest plate, and the rhythm had not shifted at all since he entered the hall. No quickening from embarrassment, no deepening from anger. He was breathing the way a man breathes when he is sitting alone in a quiet room, thinking about nothing in particular. The laughter of 100 alien warriors had passed over him like wind over stone. That was the first time I felt something other than amusement. I did not have a name for it yet. Later, I would recognize it as the first whisper of unease. Gorath ended the silence. The Korvathi war champion stepped down from his delegation's platform with a ground-shaking thud and walked toward the center of the hall, his graviton maul resting on one massive shoulder. His bone plate armor clicked and settled as he moved, the living material adjusting to his shifting weight. He stopped in the open space between the platforms and turned to face the human. His voice was deep enough to vibrate in my ribs from 20 meters away. "If this is what Earth sends to face the tide," he said, "then the Coalition has no need of humans. Go home, little soldier. Go home and polish your grandfather's armor, while the real warriors do the fighting." More laughter. Louder now, because Gorath had given it permission and direction. The human tilted his helmet slightly. Just a fraction of a degree, the kind of movement that could mean anything or nothing. Gorath took a step closer. "Unless you wish to demonstrate that your species has something to offer besides old metal and silence. I am Gorath, champion of the Korvathi Dominion. I have won 43 sanctioned combat challenges. I have broken warriors from 9 different species. If you believe that armor is worth standing in this hall, Then prove it. Here. Now. The hall buzzed with anticipation. A capability challenge was standard protocol under coalition rules. Any delegate could demand a demonstration of combat readiness from another. It was a tool usually reserved for settling disputes over tactical authority, but there was nothing in the rules that prevented it from being used to embarrass a weaker species into withdrawing. I looked at the human delegation gallery above and behind the main platform. There were 4 humans up there, diplomatic staff in civilian clothes. They looked uncomfortable, but none of them moved to intervene. One of them, a gray-haired woman in a dark suit, had her jaw set tight, and her eyes fixed on the armored figure below with an expression I could not read. It was not fear. It was something closer to resignation. The look of someone who has watched a storm approach and knows there is no stopping it. The human on the platform turned his helmet to face Gorath directly. Then he gave one slow nod. The hall erupted. Delegates shifted to get better viewing angles. Tactical displays activated along the walls, projecting odds and analysis. Every screen in the hall showed the same assessment. Gorath, Korvathi war champion, 43 victories, 0 defeats. Physical specifications off the chart for bipedal species, wielding a graviton maul, rated for hull breach operations. Against him, one human, in obsolete armor, with no visible weaponry, no combat record on file, no known augmentations. The projected outcome was not even close. Every model gave Gorath a decisive victory in under 30 seconds. The center of the hall reconfigured itself. Floor panels shifted and locked into a reinforced sparring surface. Barrier fields shimmered into place around the perimeter to protect the spectators. The formal arena protocol activated, and the station's diplomatic system announced the challenge in its flat, neutral voice. Gorath walked to one side of the arena and rolled his shoulders, the bone plate armor crackling as it flexed. He spun the graviton maul in one hand, a weapon that weighed more than most humans, and the air hummed with its displacement field. The human stepped down from his platform and walked to the opposite side of the arena. He carried no weapon. His hands hung loose at his sides. He rolled his shoulders once, a motion that produced a faint grinding sound from somewhere inside the worn armor, and then he was still. I leaned forward in spite of myself. The tactical officer in me knew this was going to be short and brutal. But the part of me that had survived 3 campaigns knew something else too. The human was not afraid. I had seen fear in every species I had ever fought alongside or against, and I knew what it looked like in body language even when the face was hidden. Tension in the shoulders, weight shifting to the back foot, hands closing into fists too early. The human showed none of it. He stood the way a man stands when he is waiting for a door to open, patient, untroubled. Gorath charged. The floor cracked under the Korvathi's first stride, 3 meters of armored mass accelerating to full combat speed in the space of a heartbeat, the graviton maul swinging in a horizontal arc that could have taken the front off a ground transport. The air screamed with the weapon's displacement field. Every tactical display in the hall tracked the strike and calculated the impact. 6,000 kilograms of force concentrated on a contact surface the size of my fist. The human moved. It was not dramatic. That was what made it so difficult to process. There was no acrobatic leap, no desperate dive, no flashy countermaneuver. He simply was not where the maul landed. He shifted his weight, turned his body, and let the weapon pass through the space he had occupied a fraction of a second earlier. The maul hit the arena floor and punched a crater into the reinforced surface, sending a shockwave through the barrier fields that made the nearest delegates flinch. Gorath recovered fast, faster than I expected from something that large. He reversed the swing and brought the maul back in a rising diagonal that would have caught most fighters in the ribs. The human stepped inside the arc, closer to Gorath rather than away, and the maul whistled past his back with centimeters to spare. He was already moving before the swing finished, circling left, staying close, denying Gorath the distance his weapon needed to build momentum. The Korvathi snarled and threw a straight kick that would have launched the human across the arena. The human read it before it came. He shifted his stance, caught the edge of the kick on his shoulder plate, absorbed the impact with a sharp exhale, and used the contact point as a pivot to spin behind Gorath's planted leg. The shoulder plate cracked. A new fracture line appeared in the already damaged metal. The human did not seem to notice. For 30 seconds, The arena was a study in opposites. Gorath was power and fury, every strike a potential killing blow, the graviton maul tearing the air apart with each swing. The human was economy and precision, never moving more than he needed, never faster than necessary, always exactly where Gorath was not. He did not try to block the maul. He did not try to match the Korvathi's strength. He treated the massive weapon like weather, something to be predicted and avoided, and he focused entirely on position. I watched his footwork and felt my unease grow into something deeper. I had studied combat doctrine from 14 civilizations. I had sparred with Korvathi trainers, Drathari blade masters, and Morvasi resonance fighters. The human's movement patterns did not match any single system. They were a hybrid, a combination of techniques drawn from fighting styles I recognized and others I did not, blended together so seamlessly that they had become something new, something personal. This was not a man who had trained in a gymnasium. This was a man who had learned to fight by fighting things that were trying to kill him. Gorath grew frustrated. His strikes widened, reaching further, swinging harder. Each one tore deeper gouges in the arena floor, but none of them connected cleanly. The crowd had stopped laughing. The tactical displays, which had confidently predicted Gorath's victory, were recalculating with increasingly confused parameters. The human was not winning. He was not dealing damage, but he was not losing either. And for a fight that was supposed to last 30 seconds, each additional moment was an embarrassment to the Korvathi champion. Then the human began to hit back. He did not use fists the way I expected. He used his open hands, his elbows, his knees, striking points that seemed random, until I realized what he was targeting. The seams in Gorath's bone-plate armor. The joints where the living material met at growth lines. The points where the regenerative structure was thinnest. He had identified the weaknesses of Korvathi boneplate, and he was exploiting them with the precision of a surgeon. A palm strike to the inside of Gorath's left elbow made the arm buckle for a fraction of a second. An elbow to the gap between the chest plate and the abdominal ridge forced a grunt of pain from the massive warrior. A knee strike to the inner thigh, aimed at the nerve cluster where the bone plate was too thin to protect, made Gorath's legs stutter mid-stride. Each strike was small, each one was nothing by itself, but they accumulated, and the Korvathi's movement began to slow, hampered by accumulating pain in joints and nerve points that his armor was not designed to protect. Gorath roared and committed everything to a single overhead smash. The graviton maul came down with enough force to breach a starship hull. The arena floor beneath it cratered and fractured outward in a web of broken material. The shockwave knocked spectators back from the barrier fields. The human was already inside the swing. He had read the commitment in Gorath's shoulders before the maul even started to rise, and he had moved forward instead of back, stepping so close that the weapon's shaft passed over his head. He was chest to chest with the Korvathi champion, inside the range of every weapon Gorath carried, in the one place the big warrior could not effectively strike. He placed his right palm flat against Gorath's throat. Not a punch, not a strike. A placement. Gentle, almost, if you ignored the positioning. His hand was directly over the Korvathi throat nerve cluster, the one point on a Korvathi body where a precise impact could bypass the bone plate entirely and disrupt autonomic function. It was a kill point. Every species that had ever fought the Korvathi knew about it. Almost none had ever been fast enough, skilled enough, or insane enough to reach it in active combat. The human pressed. It was not a hard strike. It did not need to be. The nerve cluster did the work. Gorath's eyes went wide. His grip on the maul loosened. His knees buckled and he dropped, one massive knee crashing into the broken arena floor, his chest heaving as his body tried to restart the signals that the human's palm had interrupted. The human stepped back. He dropped his hand to his side and stood there, 3 paces away from the kneeling champion, and waited. He did not press the advantage. He did not posture. He did not even breathe hard. He just waited. The hall was silent, not the uncomfortable silence of the human's entrance, but the stunned silence of 100 warriors who had just watched their assumptions shatter on the arena floor. Gorath stayed on one knee for 5 long seconds, fighting his own body's disrupted signals. Then, slowly, with the grinding effort of a mountain settling, he rose to his feet. He stared at the human. His expression was unreadable through the heavy bone ridges of his face. Then he turned and walked back to his platform without a word. The challenge was over. But the response was not what I expected. Instead of the respect that should have followed a clean victory over an undefeated champion, the hall filled with rationalizations. I heard them from every direction. The Thessari delegate muttered that Gorath had been overconfident. A Dren officer suggested that the Korvathi had underestimated his opponent and fought carelessly. And then Cephas spoke, and her words cut through the noise. "The armor," she said, her voice carrying across the hall with deliberate clarity. "The armor is the answer. Look at it. That suit looks like salvage, but no one wearing genuine obsolete equipment could move like that. The armor is a deception. It is concealing advanced combat augmentations underneath. Hidden servos, reflex accelerators, targeting systems, all of it disguised behind cosmetic damage to make it appear primitive." A murmur of agreement spread through the delegations. Heads nodded. Of course, it made sense. The human had not won through skill. He had won through hidden technology, masked inside the shell of an old suit to make his performance seem more impressive than it was. It was clever. It was dishonest. It was exactly the kind of trick a young species would use to punch above its weight. Cephas stepped down from the Drathari platform and walked to the edge of the arena. Her liquid metal armor flowed around her like quicksilver, beautiful and menacing at the same time. "Under Coalition Protocol Article 7, she said, "any delegate whose equipment integrity is questioned may be required to submit to a capability audit. I am formally requesting that the human representative remove his armor for inspection. If there is nothing hidden, there is nothing to fear from transparency." The hall waited. Protocol was clear. A formal request under Article 7 could not be refused without withdrawing from the coalition entirely. The human had two choices: remove the armor or leave. I watched him from my platform, 15 meters away. He stood in the center of the broken arena, surrounded by the craters and fractures left by Gorath's maul, and he did not move for a long time. The silence stretched. Then his hands went to his neck, to the clasps that held his helmet in place, and I saw his fingers hesitate for just a moment before they began to work the latches. I glanced up at the human delegation gallery. The gray-haired woman had closed her eyes. The man beside her had gone pale. One of the younger staffers had pressed his hand flat against the gallery railing and was gripping it so hard his knuckles had turned white. They knew what was underneath. They were not afraid of what the inspection would find. They were afraid of what it would show. The first clasp released with a metallic click that echoed in the silent hall, then the second. Then the human lifted his helmet off his head and held it at his side, and 12 civilizations got their first look at the face underneath. He was older than I expected. Not elderly, but weathered in a way that had nothing to do with age. His skin was tanned and creased, the texture of it rough from years of exposure to things that human skin was not designed to endure. A scar ran from his left temple down across his cheekbone, a thick, raised line of tissue that pulled the skin tight and gave that side of his face a permanent look of tension. His left ear was partially missing, the upper curve of it gone, healed over long ago into a smooth ridge of scar tissue. His hair was cut close to the skull, dark brown shot through with gray. But it was his eyes that stopped me. His right eye was dark brown, sharp and clear. His left eye was not. It was a prosthetic, a flat gray disc with a mechanical iris that adjusted to light with a faint clicking sound I could hear from my platform. It was not a sophisticated prosthetic. It was not the kind of elegant replacement that advanced civilizations produced, the kind that was indistinguishable from natural. It was rough, functional, field-installed. The scar tissue around the socket told me it had been put in under conditions that were very far from any medical facility. The laughter was gone. No one was smiling. The hall watched as the human set his helmet on the arena floor and moved his hands to the chest plate clasps. He worked them open one at a time. Each clasp released with a sound that seemed too loud in the silence. When the last one opened, he lifted the chest plate away from his body and set it on the floor beside the helmet. Then he straightened, and 12 civilizations saw what the worn armor had been covering. I felt my blood go cold. His torso was a map. That is the only word that works. It was a map drawn in scar tissue and surgical scars and synthetic skin patches and the marks of violence that spanned decades. Every wound told a story, and as my training kicked in and I began to read those stories, the silence in the hall deepened into something that felt like gravity. 3 parallel furrows ran across his left rib cage, deep grooves in the muscle that had healed into raised ridges of white tissue. I recognized them instantly because I had seen wounds like them before. I had made wounds like them before. They were phase claw marks, Valorian phase claws, the close combat weapon integrated into our gauntlets, designed to bypass energy shields and cut through armor at the molecular level. Those 3 furrows had been carved into this man's body by a Valorian soldier, by one of my own kind. The cold in my blood became ice. A starburst burn pattern covered his right shoulder. The skin there, a landscape of melted and reformed tissue that had healed badly and never been properly treated. The pattern was unmistakable. A Drathari thermal lance at close range, close enough that the dispersal field had not had time to spread. Thermal lance burns from that distance were almost always fatal. The heat alone should have stopped his heart. I looked at Cephas and saw that her thin smile was gone. Her angular face was blank, and her hands were very still at her sides. A section of his lower abdomen was wrong. The skin there was too smooth, too uniform. Synthetic mesh layered over what I realized was a wound that had removed a significant portion of his abdominal wall. The synthetic material was not medical grade. It was field repair, the kind of patching done in a forward operating base when there is no time to evacuate. Below the mesh, I could see the faint outline of the damage that had required it. Fragmentation wounds. Korvathi bone shrapnel, from the explosive shattering of a bone plate warrior's armor at point-blank range. I looked at Gorath. The Korvathi champion was staring at the human's abdomen with an expression I had never seen on a Korvathi face. It took me a moment to identify it, because it was so foreign on those heavy features. It was recognition. The human continued removing his armor. The gauntlets came next. His hands were a horror story, written in bone and scar tissue. Every knuckle had been broken and reknit, some of them multiple times. The knuckle ridges were calcified, built up into hard lumps of calcium, deposit from repeated trauma and healing. His fingers were slightly crooked, the joints thickened from old fractures that had set without proper medical attention. They were the hands of a man who had hit hard things over and over for years and had simply kept using them when they broke. His forearms bore the distinctive crosshatch pattern of Morvasi crystal blade fragmentation. When a Morvasi resonance blade shattered on impact, which happened when it struck something harder than it was designed to cut, the fragments scattered in a specific geometric pattern, embedding in everything within a meter radius. The scars on the human's forearms were that pattern, etched into his skin in dozens of tiny white lines that overlapped and intersected. A Morvasi delegate in the gallery above made a sound, a high, thin chime from her crystal shell that was the Morvasi equivalent of a gasp. The leg plates came off, and the catalogue of violence continued. His right leg was heavily scarred along the shin and calf, twisted burn scars from what looked like sustained chemical exposure. His left leg was worse. The left thigh, from mid-quad to just above the knee, was not flesh at all. It was prosthetic. Not sleek, not elegant, not the seamless integration of biology and machine that the elder races could produce. It was crude, functional, military-grade replacement hardware that looked like it had been installed in a field hospital and never upgraded. The knee joint clicked when he shifted his weight, a mechanical sound that was loud in the silent hall. The interface where the prosthetic met his remaining flesh was a ring of scar tissue and surgical anchors, some of them showing signs of having been replaced and re-anchored multiple times as the surrounding tissue degraded and regrew. Then he turned around, and the hall saw his back, and that was when the silence changed. There are different kinds of silence. There is the silence of surprise, which is brief and quickly filled. There is the silence of confusion, which hums with unasked questions. And there is the silence of fear, which is absolute and heavy, and presses down on everyone in the room like the weight of deep water. That third silence fell across the Grand Axis Hall, when the human turned his back to the assembly. A single scar ran from his right shoulder blade to his left hip. It was not like the other scars. It was not a clean cut, or a burn, or a fragmentation pattern. It was organic, irregular, branching, a thick trunk of raised tissue, with smaller ridges spreading outward from it, like the roots of a tree pressed into his skin. The tissue was discolored, darker than the surrounding skin in some places, lighter in others, modeled in a pattern that did not belong to any weapon I knew. Except one. An Asherin-tide feeder tendril, the main appendage of the swarm's consumption organisms, the thing that latched onto a target and began dissolving it for absorption. The scar was the signature of a feeder tendril that had attached to this man's back and begun the dissolution process. The branching ridges were the marks of the secondary tendrils, the ones that spread outward from the main contact point to accelerate consumption. Every species in the hall knew what that mark meant. The Asherin-tide did not leave survivors. When a feeder tendril attached, the organism was dissolved in minutes, consumed and absorbed into the swarm. There was no medical procedure, no technological intervention, no miracle of combat medicine that could reverse the process once it began. The only survivors of feeder tendril contact were the ones who died from something else before the dissolution finished. This man had the scar. This man was standing in front of us. This man was alive. Someone in the gallery whispered a name. I did not hear it clearly at first. It was a human name, 2 syllables, spoken with a reverence that did not belong to the sound of laughter and mockery that had filled this hall minutes earlier. Then another voice said it, louder, and another. The name moved through the hall like a shockwave, jumping from delegation to delegation, and I watched the reactions cascade. The Korvathi delegates went rigid. The Drathari stopped moving entirely. The Thessari shifted in their stealth weave, suddenly uncertain. The Dren Recall drones pulled in tight around their operators, in an unconscious defensive response. Elias Cade. I did not recognize the name immediately. Human names were not part of my training, and my intelligence briefings on Earth's military had focused on fleet capabilities and strategic doctrine, not individual soldiers. But the Korvathi recognized it. I could see it in the way Gorath's bone plate armor suddenly locked rigid, the living material responding to a surge of adrenaline that the champion could not control. The Drathari recognized it. Cephas took a half-step backward, an involuntary retreat that she covered immediately, but not before I noticed. The whispers became murmurs, and the murmurs became a low hum of voices, and in the center of the arena, the human stood with his back to the assembly, covered in the evidence of every war the galaxy had fought in the last 40 years, and waited for the noise to die. My tactical display was filling with data as I searched the name. Elias Cade, human, born on a colony world called New Lancaster 71 standard years ago, enlisted in the Earth Defense Force at age 17, active service record, spanning 54 years with no break in service, no promotion above the rank of senior warrant officer, which I later learned was a human rank that existed in the space between enlisted soldiers and commissioned officers, a rank for people who were too valuable to waste on paperwork and too dangerous to put behind a desk. The combat record was what stopped my breath. He had been at the Korath Corridor during the Second Border War between humanity and the Korvathi Dominion, 17 years ago. The Korath Corridor was a narrow passage through an asteroid belt that served as the only access point to a cluster of human colony worlds. The Korvathi had pushed through with overwhelming force, expecting to sweep the colonies in days. They had been stopped, not by a fleet, not by a fortified position, by a single forward operating base, commanded by a warrant officer who held the corridor for 11 days against continuous assault, using improvised defenses, salvaged weapons, and a tactical creativity that the Korvathi War College still studied. 11 days. I had studied the Battle of the Korath Corridor in my own training. It was taught as an example of asymmetric defense doctrine, with the specific identities of the defenders redacted because the case study was meant to be about tactics, not personalities. The officer who had held that corridor had been listed only by rank and species. Human, senior warrant officer. Casualty rate in his unit was 94%. He was among the 6% who walked out. He had been at Nexus 4 during the first Escherine incursion, 9 years ago. Nexus 4 was the first major engagement between the combined civilizations and the Tide, and it had been a catastrophe. 3 battalions from 4 different species had been deployed to hold the colony. The Tide consumed them in hours, The planet was classified as lost. No survivors were expected. Elias Cade had walked out, not alone. He had carried 2 wounded soldiers, one human and one Thessari, on his back for 30 kilometers, through tide-infested terrain, navigating around swarm concentrations by tracking their movement patterns through vibrations in the ground. The feeder tendril scar on his back was from that march. A tendril had attached to him during the crossing. He had cut it off with a combat knife, cauterized the wound with a thermal charge, and kept walking. He had fought in the Valorian human skirmish at Drenholm Station. The phase claw scars on his ribs were from that engagement. He had fought Drathari raiders during the Merchant Belt crisis. The thermal lance burn on his shoulder was from a Drathari boarding party that he had repelled single-handedly, in a corridor so narrow that his armor's shoulder plates scraped both walls. He had been present at the Crystal Siege of Morvasi Prime, where a human peacekeeping contingent had been caught in the crossfire of a Morvasi civil war. The fragmentation scars on his forearms were from that deployment. He had fought nearly every species in the room. He had bled at the hands of nearly every civilization represented in the Grand Axis Hall, and he was standing in front of them, alive, in the same armor he had worn through all of it. The armor was not a relic. The armor was not obsolete. The armor was original issue. He had been wearing it for 54 years. Every dent was a battle. Every scorch mark was a war. Every scratch and crack and crude repair was a moment when the galaxy had tried to kill Elias Cade and failed. 3 separate species in the coalition had classified him as a strategic-level threat. Not his unit, not his fleet. Him, personally. He was in the threat databases of civilizations that had weapons capable of cracking planets, listed as an individual requiring special tactical consideration. One man, in worn armor, with a mechanical eye and a clicking knee, and hands that had been broken more times than most people had been bruised. The hall was absolutely silent. Not a sound, not a whisper, not a breath. 12 civilizations stared at the scarred back of a man they had been laughing at 5 minutes ago, and the weight of what they were looking at pressed down on the room like an atmosphere collapsing. Elias Cade turned to face the assembly. His one real eye moved slowly across the delegations, pausing briefly on each platform, and I had the unsettling sensation that he was cataloging everyone in the room the way a predator catalogs the landscape. Not with aggression, not with hostility, with the calm, complete awareness of someone who has been in so many dangerous rooms that the assessment is automatic. He spoke for the first time, and his voice was quiet, rough, unremarkable, the kind of voice that would disappear in a crowd. "Earth didn't send a delegation," he said. "Earth sent me." He paused. His mechanical eye clicked as the iris adjusted to the lighting. The Asharan tide consumed 3 civilizations in the last decade. It is heading for the inner systems. By this time next year, it will reach the first major population centers. Valorian, Korvathi, Drathari. It does not matter. The tide does not distinguish between species. It consumes everything. His eye swept the room again, and when it passed over me, I felt a chill that went deeper than my skin. There was no anger in that gaze, no accusation, just a vast, tired patience. The patience of a man who had been trying to tell people the same thing for years and had learned that words only worked after the bleeding started. I have fought the tide. I have felt it try to eat me alive. I have watched it dissolve soldiers from species that thought they were invincible. I am here because I know what is coming, and I know how to fight it. And I know that if you do not stop measuring each other's armor and start preparing for what is out there, every scar on my body becomes meaningless, because there will be no one left to remember any of it. He let the silence hold for 3 long seconds. "Are we going to talk about the tide, or do you need to see more?" Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The laughter was a memory now, distant and shameful, and in its place was something I had never felt in a room full of warriors. Respect born from fear. The coalition meeting resumed, and everything had changed. The platforms that had been arranged in a hierarchy of prestige, with the elder races closest to the center and the younger species pushed to the margins, suddenly felt arbitrary. The delegations that had been competing for leadership fell into an uneasy quiet. When Elias Cade began outlining his assessment of the Asharan threat, nobody interrupted. He did not raise his voice. He did not use dramatic gestures or rhetorical flourishes. He spoke the way a mechanic describes what is wrong with an engine, plain and specific and unemotional, and somehow that was more terrifying than any war speech I had ever heard. Because he was not trying to inspire us, he was not trying to lead us. He was simply telling us what was true, and the truth was that we were running out of time. He described the tide's behavior patterns with the precision of someone who had observed them firsthand. The swarm operated through a distributed coordination intelligence, millions of individual organisms, linked by a resonance network that allowed them to adapt to countermeasures in real time. Standard weapons worked for minutes at best before the swarm restructured to neutralize them. Energy weapons, kinetic weapons, chemical weapons. The tide had encountered and overcome all of them. The three civilizations it had consumed had each believed they had found the solution. Each had been wrong. He described the feeder organisms, the primary consumption units of the swarm, and the way his voice stayed flat and clinical while talking about creatures that had literally tried to dissolve him alive was something I will never forget. He described their tendril attachment process, their dissolution enzyme composition, and their vulnerability to specific resonance frequencies that could disrupt their coordination nodes. He knew these frequencies because he had tested them in the field, on Nexus 4, while carrying wounded soldiers through 30 kilometers of infested terrain. The data had been recorded by his armor's primitive sensors and transmitted to Earth's military command after his extraction. Cephas asked a question about the resonance frequencies. Her voice had lost its cutting edge. She spoke to Cade the way one professional speaks to another, carefully, and with the unspoken acknowledgement that the person you are addressing knows more than you do. Cade answered her question. Then he answered 3 more from the Thessari delegation, and 2 from the Dren, and 1 from a Morvasi weapons specialist who wanted technical details about the resonance disruptor Cade had field-tested. He answered each one with the same flat precision, offering data, specifications, and tactical recommendations without any apparent ego or agenda. But not everyone in the hall accepted the new dynamic. I watched it happen gradually, the way cracks spread through ice. The initial shock of the reveal was fading, and the political realities of a 12-species coalition were reasserting themselves. Cephas had gone quiet, but her eyes were calculating. Gorath had returned to his platform and stood with his arms folded, his bone-plate armor still locked rigid. A Thessari delegate was whispering urgently to colleagues in their shimmer-edged stealth weave. The fracture came from the Korvathi, not from Gorath, who had the look of someone processing a profound personal humiliation, but from a senior Korvathi diplomat named Vorith, who stepped forward and spoke with the particular tone of someone reasserting authority through formal process. "The human's combat record is noted," Vorith said, each word measured and deliberate. "His experience against the Asharan is valuable, but this coalition is not a hierarchy of scars. One warrior, however seasoned, cannot dictate strategy for a combined fleet of 12 civilizations. Leadership must be determined by fleet strength, tactical infrastructure, and strategic capability. By those measures, the Korvathi Dominion, the Drathari Ascendancy, and the Valorian Combined Fleet are the natural command authorities. The human should serve as a consultant, an advisor, nothing more." It was a reasonable argument. That was what made it dangerous, because Vorith was not wrong about fleet strength and infrastructure, and several delegations were visibly relieved to hear someone reassert the established order. The elder races had the ships, the technology, and the command structures. One human with scars and stories did not change the mathematics of military power. Cade listened to all of it without expression. When Vorith finished, several other delegates spoke in agreement, and the conversation began to drift back toward the pre-reveal dynamic, with the major powers positioning themselves for command authority, and the smaller species, including humanity, being gently but firmly edged toward the margins. I expected Cade to argue, to invoke his record, to demand respect, to push back against the hierarchy with the weight of his experience. Instead, he did something that surprised me more than anything else that day. He agreed. "You are right," he said, and the hall went quiet again, startled by the concession. "One man does not command a fleet. I am not here to lead your ships. I am here because I have fought the thing that is coming, and I know something none of you know yet." He paused, and in that pause, I felt the air in the room change. The tide is not interested in your fleet strength. It does not care about your strategic infrastructure. The three civilizations it consumed all had superior military capabilities to anything in this room. They lost because they fought the tide the way they fought each other, with formations and doctrine, and the assumption that the enemy would respond to force the way other civilizations respond to force. The tide is not a civilization. It is a hunger. You cannot intimidate it. You cannot outmaneuver it with fleet tactics. You cannot negotiate with it. You can only understand how it feeds and disrupt the process before it finishes. He tapped the scar on his back, the feeder tendril mark, a gesture so casual that it took me a moment to register what he was touching. I know how it feeds. I know because it tried to feed on me. I am the only living being in this hall who has been partially consumed by the Escharin tide and survived to analyze the data. You can argue about command authority for as long as you want, but while you argue, the tide is moving, and every hour you spend deciding who sits at the head of the table is an hour it spends getting closer to your homeworlds. The room absorbed that. Voreth opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. Cephas looked at Cade with an expression that had shifted from calculation to something closer to grudging respect. Gorath had not moved from his folded arms stance, but his bone plate had finally relaxed, the living material settling into its natural configuration. The coalition meeting continued. Cade did not push for command. He presented data, offered assessments, and deferred to the military leaders of the larger delegations on matters of fleet disposition and logistics. But on anything related to the tide itself, its behavior, its weaknesses, its adaptation patterns, his voice was the one the room listened to. Not because they wanted to, because they had no choice. He was the only person in the hall who had touched the enemy and lived. The meeting ran for 6 hours. By the end, a preliminary defense framework had been established, built around a layered strategy that combined fleet-scale engagement with the resonance disruption techniques Cade had field-tested. It was not a complete plan. It was a beginning. The delegations agreed to reconvene the following day to finalize fleet assignments and command structures. When the session ended, delegates began filtering out of the hall in clusters, the natural groupings of allies and rivals reforming as the formal atmosphere dissolved. I stayed on my platform, reviewing my notes and trying to process everything I had witnessed. I watched Cade collect his armor from the arena floor. He picked up each piece and inspected it with the practiced eye of a man performing a task he had done thousands of times. He ran his fingers along the new crack in his shoulder plate from Gorath's kick. He tested the clasps on the chest plate, checking each one for damage. Then he began putting the armor back on, piece by piece, strapping the worn metal over the scarred landscape of his body. I found myself walking toward him before I consciously decided to do so. He noticed me when I was 5 meters away. His mechanical eye tracked my approach, the iris clicking through focal adjustments, and I felt the weight of that gray disk assessing me with a thoroughness that my own tactical systems would have envied. I was wearing Valorian phase weave, the same type of armor that had produced the scars on his ribs, and I saw his eye linger on my gauntlets, specifically on the phase claw housings built into the knuckle ridges. Kael Shureth, I said. Valorian Combined Fleet, Tactical Division. He nodded. I know. Your phase weave is the Mark 7 variant. Updated targeting matrix in the left gauntlet. Your stance says trained fighter, but your weight distribution favors the right side, which means either a training habit or an old injury to the left leg. He had dissected my combat profile in 5 seconds from 15 meters away. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. Not from fear, exactly. From the sudden understanding that I was standing in front of a man who saw the world the way a weapons system sees a targeting field. Everything was data. Everything was assessment. Everything was a potential threat to be cataloged and filed. I wanted to ask about Drenholm Station, I said, because I had to know. The phase claw scars on his ribs. Drenholm was a skirmish that my people rarely discussed. A brief and ugly engagement during a territorial dispute that had been quietly resolved through diplomatic channels afterward. My uncle served in that engagement. Cade finished clasping his chest plate and looked at me with his one real eye. There was no hostility in his expression, no accusation, just the tired patience I had seen when he addressed the assembly. It was a misunderstanding that got out of hand, he said. Your people boarded our station thinking we were smuggling weapons into a disputed zone. We were not. But by the time anyone figured that out, people on both sides had already started dying. I lost 4 soldiers. Your uncle's unit lost 7. Everyone involved wished it had gone differently. He picked up his helmet and held it under his arm. The scars are not grudges, he said. They are lessons. Every one of them taught me something about the species that made them. How you fight, how you think, what you fear, and what you protect. That is why Earth sent me. Because I have bled at the hands of everyone in this room, and the bleeding taught me how to work with all of you. He turned and walked toward the exit, his worn armor clicking and grinding softly with each step, the sound of a machine that had long since passed the end of its designed service life, but refused to stop functioning because the man inside it refused to stop moving. I watched him go, and I thought about the laughter that had greeted his entrance. The mocking, dismissive, confident laughter of 100 warriors who had looked at that battered armor and seen weakness. I thought about the silence that had replaced it when the armor came off and the scars were revealed, and I thought about what Cade had said about the tide, that it did not care about fleet strength or strategic infrastructure, that it only consumed. The tide was coming, and the only man in the galaxy who had survived its touch was walking through the halls of Citadel Oranath in armor that looked like it belonged in a scrapyard, carrying the knowledge that could save us all in a body that was more scar tissue than whole flesh. And he had not raised his voice once. I went back to my quarters that night and reviewed every intelligence briefing the Valorian Combined Fleet had ever produced on humanity. I read about their history, their wars, their expansion into space. I read about their biology, their stubborn refusal to die when any reasonable organism would have surrendered to the mathematics of damage and simply stopped. I read about their military doctrine, which placed an absurd emphasis on individual resilience and adaptability over standardized combat systems. And I began to understand, for the first time, why the Asharan tide had not yet consumed the galaxy. Because Elias Cade was not unique. He was not a mutation, or an aberration, or a singular freak of nature. He was a product of a species that built its warriors not in factories but in furnaces, that measured strength not in the quality of the steel, but in the number of times it had been folded and hammered, and heated, and beaten, and folded again. The armor was not worn because it was old. The armor was worn because it had been everywhere that mattered, and the man inside it had survived every one of those places, and he had come here not to impress us or to lead us, but to do the only thing he knew how to do. Fight. Survive. Keep going. The next morning, I arrived at the Grand Axis Hall early. The delegations were still filtering in, the platforms filling with representatives, adjusting their pristine armor, and checking their gleaming weapons. I took my position on the Valorian platform and waited. Cade was already there. He stood on the human platform in his worn armor, hands at his sides, helmet on, the scratch across his visor catching the light. He had not polished the armor. He had not repaired the new crack from Gorath's kick. He stood exactly as he had the day before, scarred metal over scarred flesh, silent and patient, and waiting for the galaxy to catch up with what he already knew. No one laughed. I felt the station shudder before the alarm sounded. It was a deep structural vibration that I felt through the soles of my boots, a frequency that resonated in my bones and made my teeth ache. The Grand Axis Hall's environmental systems flickered once, twice, and then the emergency lighting activated, bathing everything in the red-orange glow of a station-wide alert. The alarm came half a second later, a piercing tone that cut through every conversation and silenced every delegate mid-word. Automated warnings scrolled across every tactical display in the hall. Long-range sensor array, unidentified mass signature, bearing 274 by 038, range decreasing, speed increasing, classification pending. Then the classification came through and the hall erupted. Asharan tide. Tendril mass, forward scout configuration, estimated biomass equivalent to a mid-range assault fleet. Trajectory confirmed. It was heading directly for Citadel Oranath. Estimated time to contact. 11 hours. Panic is an interesting thing to watch in a room full of warriors. It does not look like running and screaming. It looks like voices rising, hands moving faster, eyes widening. the controlled discipline of military professionals cracking at the edges as the gap between training and reality opens beneath their feet. The coalition had been assembled to face the tide months from now, after fleets were gathered and strategies finalized and command structures established. No one was ready. No one had their full forces available. The delegations at Oranath had personal guard ships, diplomatic escorts, a handful of combat vessels per species. Not enough. Not nearly enough. Vorith was shouting at the Korvathi diplomatic staff. Cephas was issuing rapid-fire orders to her Drathari officers, her liquid metal armor shifting restlessly with her agitation. The Thessari had activated their stealth weave and were shimmering at the edges of perception, an instinctive defensive response. The Dren delegates were surrounded by clouds of agitated drones buzzing in tight, frantic patterns. In the center of the chaos, one figure was not moving. Elias Cade stood on the human platform and looked at the tactical displays. His helmet was on. His visor reflected the red emergency lighting. His hands hung at his sides. His breathing, visible in the rise and fall of his dented chest plate, had not changed. He had known this would happen. I understood that with a certainty that went beyond logic or evidence. He had known the tide would come sooner than projected. He had known because he understood the tide better than anyone alive. And the tide's behavior was not random. It was adaptive. It had detected the coalition forming, and it had accelerated its approach to hit them before they were ready. Exactly as it had done at Nexus 4. Exactly as it had done at every engagement where organized resistance tried to form before the swarm arrived. Cade stepped down from his platform and walked to the central tactical display, the large holographic projection in the center of the hall that showed the station's surrounding space. He studied it for 10 seconds while the chaos swirled around him. Then he reached out and touched the display controls. The holographic projection shifted. Overlays appeared. Movement corridors, defensive positions, choke points in the station's architecture, fire lanes for the escort ships, kill zones in the approach vectors. A layered defense plan materialized on the display with the speed and precision of something that had been designed long before this moment. He had prepared this. He had come to this coalition knowing that the tide might arrive early, and he had already built a contingency defense plan for the station. The realization sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with temperature. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His voice cut through the noise the way a knife cuts through cloth, not by force, but by sharpness. "Listen to me," he said, and the hall listened. "The Tide Scout will hit this station in 11 hours. We do not have our fleets. We do not have our full forces. We have what we brought with us, and that has to be enough." He pointed to sectors on the holographic display as he spoke. "Korvathi forces take the primary docking corridors. Your bone plate armor is the best physical barrier we have against feeder tendril contact. You hold the main approaches, and you do not give ground. Drathari forces establish thermal denial corridors in the secondary access routes. Your thermal lances can create sustained heat barriers that disrupt tendril coordination at close range. Morvasi forces deploy crystal resonance traps at every junction point. Your resonance technology is the closest thing we have to the frequency disruption that neutralizes their coordination nodes." He looked directly at me. "Valorians take rapid response. Phase weave gives you speed and adaptive defense. When a sector is breached, you get there first, contain it, and hold until reinforcement arrives." He did not ask if we agreed. He did not offer alternatives. He did not couch his orders in diplomatic language. He spoke the way a man speaks when the building is on fire and there is no time for debate. "I will hold the central hub," he said. "That is where the tide will push hardest. It always hits the center. It is drawn to the densest concentration of organic signatures, and the central hub is where the most people are." Gorath spoke from his platform, his deep voice cutting through the murmur that followed Cade's assignments. "You will hold the most dangerous position alone?" Cade looked at the Korvathi champion. "I have done it before." No one argued. 11 hours earlier, they had laughed at him. Now they moved to follow his orders with the urgent efficiency of people who have realized that the man they mocked is the only one in the room who knows what is coming. I organized my Valorian rapid response unit in the outer ring of the station, checking equipment, running phase weave diagnostics, and trying to calm the fear that was building in my chest. I had fought in 3 campaigns. I had faced Korvathi berserkers and Drathari raiding parties, and the cold precision of Morvasi crystal blade specialists. But I had never faced the Asharan tide. I had only read about it. I had only seen the aftermath in intelligence photographs. Dissolved bodies, consumed structures, entire colonies reduced to organic slurry. The hours passed with the terrible speed of time before combat. Preparations that should have taken days were compressed into frantic activity. Korvathi warriors sealed themselves into the primary corridors, their bone plate locked into defensive configurations, graviton weapons charged and ready. Drathari officers positioned thermal lance emplacements at secondary junctions, the weapons glowing with contained heat that made the air shimmer. Morvasi technicians planted crystal resonance devices at intersection points throughout the station, each one tuned to the specific frequency Cade had identified during his field testing on Nexus 4. I checked on Cade once, 3 hours before contact. He was in the central hub, alone, walking the perimeter of the main atrium with the measured pace of a man taking a stroll through a garden. He was checking sightlines, testing door mechanisms, measuring distances between structural supports. His worn armor clicked softly as he moved. "You should have backup in here," I said. He looked at me. "Everyone is needed in their assigned sectors. If the outer ring holds, the center holds. If the outer ring does not hold, more bodies in here just means more targets for the feeders." "And if they break through to you?" He paused his circuit of the atrium and turned to face me fully. His mechanical eye clicked through a focal adjustment. "Then I do what I always do," he said. "I make them wish they had picked a different corridor." There was no bravado in it, no posturing. He said it the way a man says he will go to work tomorrow morning. It was simply what he did, what he had always done, what the scars on his body proved he would keep doing until something finally managed to kill him. I left him there and returned to my position. The tide hit Citadel Oranath at 1400 station time, 2 hours ahead of the projected contact window. It came in fast, faster than the sensor models had predicted, a writhing mass of biological matter that enveloped the station's outer hull like a living storm. I watched it on the tactical feeds and felt my stomach twist. The scout mass was larger than estimated, far larger. What had been classified as equivalent to a mid-range fleet was closer to a full assault swarm, hundreds of millions of individual organisms moving in coordinated waves, guided by the resonance intelligence that linked them into a single predatory entity. The first breach came in the eastern docking bay. The tide did not use the airlocks. It dissolved the hull plating. Feeder organisms secreted their dissolution enzymes directly onto the station's armored exterior, and the metal simply melted away, opening gaps through which the swarm poured like water through broken fingers. The Korvathi forces in the eastern corridor met them head-on. I monitored the engagement through my tactical display and heard the sounds through the station's internal communication channels. The deep, vibrating war cries of Korvathi warriors, the wet, hissing sound of feeder tendrils striking bone plate armor, the crack of graviton weapons firing into dense masses of biological matter. The Korvathi held. Their bone plate was extraordinary, regenerating damage almost as fast as the feeders could inflict it. Gorath was in the middle of it, his massive frame blocking an entire corridor width, his graviton maul crushing feeders by the dozen with each swing. But the tide adapted. Within 8 minutes, the feeder organisms had altered their dissolution enzyme composition. The new formula attacked bone plate differently, targeting the growth lines, the same weaknesses Cade had exploited in the sparring match. The Korvathi regeneration could not keep pace. Warriors who had been shrugging off tendril strikes began taking damage. Bone plate cracked and did not reform. The corridor began to buckle. My unit received the call 4 minutes later. Eastern corridor. Secondary breach. Korvathi lines holding, but deteriorating. Valorian rapid response requested. We moved. 6 Valorians in phase weave, sprinting through the station corridors at a speed that no other bipedal species in the coalition could match. Phase weave enhanced our natural agility, allowing us to move through spaces that would have bottlenecked heavier forces. We reached the eastern corridor in 90 seconds. I had read about the Asharan tide. I had studied it in intelligence briefings and tactical simulations. Nothing prepared me for seeing it in person. The corridor was alive. That is the only way to describe it. The walls, the floor, the ceiling. Everything was covered in a writhing layer of biological matter that pulsed and shifted and reached for anything organic that came within range. Feeder tendrils, some as thick as my arm, others thin as wire, extended from the mass in every direction, probing, searching, latching onto anything they could dissolve. The air was thick with a chemical smell that burned my throat, the byproduct of the dissolution enzymes breaking down the station's metal structure. Korvathi warriors were fighting in the center of it, islands of bone plate resistance in a sea of consuming flesh. Gorath was still standing, his armor cracked and leaking the blue fluid that served as Korvathi blood, his graviton maul swinging in arcs that cleared temporary spaces in the swarm mass. But for every feeder he crushed, 10 more flowed in to replace it. The swarm was not fighting them, it was drowning them. My unit engaged. Phase weave was effective against the feeders. The molecular disruption field that powered our phase claws tore through the biological matter with satisfying efficiency. But the same adaptation problem hit us within minutes. The swarm restructured. Feeders that had been vulnerable to phase disruption developed a resistance layer, a hardened outer membrane that deflected our attacks. I had to increase the phase frequency twice in 5 minutes, burning through my gauntlet power reserves at an unsustainable rate. We held the eastern corridor for 20 minutes. By the end of it, 2 of my Valorians were wounded, 1 seriously, and the Korvathi line had been pushed back 30 meters. The swarm was winning, not through superior tactics or overwhelming force, but through relentless adaptation. Every weapon we used, it learned. Every technique we employed, it countered. It was not fighting us the way an army fights. It was evolving against us in real time. Then the feeds from the central hub lit up with activity, and I heard something through the communication channel that made me stop mid-swing. Cade's voice. Flat. Calm. Clinical. Central hub breach. They are in. Moving to engage. The central hub was the heart of the station. If the tide took the hub, it would have access to every corridor, every compartment, every life support system. The hub was where the non-combat personnel had been evacuated, hundreds of diplomatic staff, technicians, medical workers. If the hub fell, they died. I pulled my unit from the eastern corridor, leaving the Korvathi to hold what they could, and we ran. Through corridors that were increasingly slick with biological residue, past junctions where Morvasi crystal traps had detonated and left patches of shattered resonance crystal and dead feeder organisms, through thermal denial corridors where Drathari lance emplacements blazed with sustained heat that kept the swarm at bay but filled the air with the choking smoke of burned organic matter. We reached the central hub, and I saw Elias Cade fight. Not the controlled, precise demonstration he had given in the sparring match with Gorath, not the clinical, economical movement of a man proving a point. This was different. This was what lived beneath the patience and the flat voice and the tired eyes. This was what the worn armor had been built to contain. He was in the center of the main atrium, surrounded. Feeder organisms poured through 3 breaches in the hub's walls, flooding the open space with a tide of consuming flesh. Tendrils reached for him from every direction. The air was thick with dissolution chemicals. The floor was dissolving beneath his boots. And he was destroying them. His movements were not elegant. They were brutal, efficient, and utterly without hesitation. He fought with a combat knife in one hand and a short-range kinetic weapon in the other, switching between them with a fluidity that suggested he had been doing this for so long that the transitions were autonomic, happening below the level of conscious thought. The knife found the nerve clusters in the feeder organisms, the small nodes of biological circuitry that connected individual feeders to the swarm's coordination intelligence. Each strike disrupted the local network, causing clusters of feeders to go feral, turning on each other in confused aggression. The kinetic weapon punched holes through the denser masses of swarm tissue, creating gaps that prevented the feeders from forming the connected lattice they needed for coordinated attacks. He was not just fighting the organisms in front of him, he was fighting the network, the intelligence, the coordination system that made the tide a swarm instead of a collection of individual predators. He was taking it apart from the inside. A tendril caught him across the back, across the same place as the old scar. I saw his body arch with the impact, saw the dissolution enzymes begin to eat into his already damaged armor. He reached behind him, grabbed the tendril with his bare gauntlet, and ripped it free. The gauntlet's metal surface was already pitting from the enzyme contact, the alloy dissolving under his fingers. He ignored it. He threw the severed tendril aside and kept fighting. I led my unit into the hub and we joined him. 6 Valorians in phase weave, fighting alongside a human in worn armor. And for the first time in my life, I felt like the support element. The Valorians are proud of their combat prowess. We train for decades. We master multiple forms of combat doctrine. We wear the finest tactical equipment our civilization produces. Elias Cade fought better than any of us. Not faster, not stronger, better. He read the swarm the way a linguist reads a language, understanding the patterns, predicting the movements, exploiting the grammar of its coordination network. He knew where the feeders would push before they pushed. He knew which tendrils were probing and which were committed strikes. He knew the rhythm of the swarm's adaptation cycle, and he changed his tactics just before each adaptation completed, staying one step ahead of an intelligence that had consumed 3 civilizations. He took damage. A tendril caught his left arm, and the armor there cracked open, exposing the scarred flesh underneath. The dissolution enzyme hit his skin, and he made a sound, a sharp, bitten-off grunt. That was the most emotion I had heard from him, but he did not stop. He shifted the knife to his right hand and kept cutting. A feeder organism latched onto his leg plate, and he smashed it against a structural column without breaking stride. His prosthetic knee was grinding, the mechanical joint protesting the abuse, but it held. Everything about him held. Everything about him refused to break completely. The turning point came when the swarm concentrated its mass for a coordinated push through the largest breach. I saw it building, the biological matter thickening, compressing, forming into a dense wedge of consuming flesh that would slam through the atrium and overwhelm everything in its path. I calculated the mass and knew we could not stop it. There were not enough of us. The wedge would hit, and the hub would fall, and everyone behind us would die. Cade saw it too. He stopped fighting the feeders around him, and reached for something on his armor's belt. A device I had not noticed before. Small, cylindrical, attached to his waist with a crude mounting bracket. He pulled it free, and I saw the crystal matrix inside it. A Morvasi resonance crystal. Modified, rewired, integrated into a human-built housing that was held together with field welds and improvised circuitry. A resonance disruptor, the weapon he had described during the coalition meeting, the one he had field-tested on Nexus 4. He had been carrying it the entire time. He activated it. The frequency that erupted from the device was beyond my hearing range, but I felt it. Every cell in my body vibrated with it. A deep, bone-level hum that made my vision blur, and my phase weave stutter. The effect on the swarm was catastrophic. The coordination nodes in every feeder organism within 50 meters shattered. The resonance network that linked them collapsed. The dense wedge of biological matter that had been building for the coordinated push disintegrated into chaos. Millions of individual feeders, suddenly disconnected from the guiding intelligence, turned feral. They attacked each other. They attacked the walls. They attacked anything organic within reach, including themselves, tearing into the swarm mass with the mindless aggression of organisms that had lost the signal, telling them what to eat. Now, Cade said, and his voice was still flat, still calm, still unremarkable, even as the swarm tore itself apart around him. Push them back. All units, push them to the breach points. They cannot recoordinate for 90 seconds. Move. We moved. Every species in the central hub, Valorian, Korvathi reinforcements that had arrived behind us, a squad of Drathari thermal lancers, even a pair of Morvasi fighters whose crystal shells were cracked and leaking harmonic fluid. All of us pushed forward together. We drove the feral feeders back through the breaches, back into the corridors, back toward the hull gaps they had entered through. The Drathari sealed the breaches with sustained thermal lance fire, welding the station's own structure closed with walls of molten metal. The hub held. The fighting continued for 3 more hours in other sectors, but the tide's coordination had been fundamentally disrupted. Cade's resonance pulse had not just affected the central hub. The frequency had propagated through the station's own structure, the metal corridors and supports acting as waveguides, and had degraded the swarm's coordination network across the entire station. Feeder organisms throughout Oranath went feral in waves, and the defenders, following the framework Cade had established, exploited each disruption cycle to push the swarm back. By nightfall, station time, the Tide scout mass had withdrawn, not defeated, not destroyed. The swarm did not die, it retreated to regroup and adapt. But it had been denied. Citadel Oranath still stood, the coalition still stood, and in the central hub, surrounded by the dissolving remains of feeder organisms and the acid-scarred wreckage of the station's beautiful architecture, 12 species looked at each other, with something that had not existed in the hall that morning. Unity. Not the performative unity of a diplomatic summit, not the calculated unity of a strategic alliance. The real thing, the kind that only forms when people bleed together and survive together and learn, in the space between terror and relief, that the person fighting beside them is the only reason they are still breathing. I found Cade sitting against a bulkhead in the central hub corridor. He was bleeding from 4 new wounds. The tendril hit on his arm had eaten through the armor and the skin beneath, leaving a raw, chemical-burned patch that would add another scar to his collection. His chest plate had a new crack running from the old dent over his heart to the lower edge. The scratch on his visor had deepened into a fracture that spiderwebbed across the left side. His prosthetic knee was making a grinding sound with every micro-adjustment, the mechanism damaged from the fighting. He looked exhausted. For the first time, the flat, patient expression on his weathered face had given way to something more human. Fatigue. Pain. The drained, hollow look of a man who has given everything and is running on the fumes of whatever fuel keeps him going when the tanks are empty. Gorath appeared at the end of the corridor. The Korvathi champion was in terrible shape, his bone-plate armor cracked in a dozen places, blue blood seeping from wounds that his regeneration was struggling to close. He had held the eastern corridor for the entire engagement. His warriors had taken the heaviest casualties of any delegation. He had earned every fracture. He walked to where Cade sat and stood over him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Gorath reached down with one massive hand. Cade looked at the hand. Then he looked up at Gorath's face. Then he reached up and took it, and the Korvathi champion pulled the human to his feet with a gentleness that seemed impossible from something that large. They stood there for a second, hand in hand, the Korvathi warrior who had mocked the worn armor and the human who wore it, and something passed between them that did not need words in any language. Around them, delegates from 12 species were tending to each other's wounded. A Valorian medic was treating a Drethari officer's burns with phase-weave medical protocols adapted on the spot for non-Valorian physiology. A Korvathi warrior was carrying a wounded Morvasi fighter whose crystal shell had shattered, cradling the fragile being against his bone-plate chest with absurd delicacy. A human diplomatic aide, the young man from the gallery who had gripped the railing so hard his knuckles turned white, was holding a compress against a Thessari delegate's wound, while the shimmering alien guided his hands with gentle corrections. The tide had given us something it never intended to give. It had given us a reason to stop measuring each other and start protecting each other. It had given us a war that was bigger than our rivalries and our pride and our gleaming armor. I stood in the corridor of the damaged central hub and looked at Elias Cade as he straightened in his worn armor, testing his weight on his grinding knee, rotating his acid-burned arm to check the range of motion. New damage layered over old, new cracks over old cracks, new scars forming over old scars. The armor was uglier than ever. It looked like it should be in a recycling furnace. It looked like it was held together by stubbornness and memory. And I understood, finally, what I was looking at. I was not looking at worn equipment. I was not looking at a relic or a museum piece or a soldier too stubborn to requisition a new suit. I was looking at a record. A physical, tangible, wearable record of every time the galaxy had tried to kill one man and failed. Every dent was a death refused. Every scorch mark was a war survived. Every crude weld and mismatched patch and acid-etched surface was a moment when Elias Cade should have died and chose not to. The armor was not old. The armor was unfinished, because the man wearing it was not done yet. The coalition would move against the Escharon tide. Not because the diplomats had negotiated an agreement or the generals had calculated the optimal force disposition, because a man in worn armor had stood in a room full of gleaming warriors and shown them what strength actually looked like, not the shine of new equipment or the polish of untested technology, the scars, the dents, the proof that you had been through the fire and walked out the other side still standing. When the coalition fleet assembled in the weeks that followed, the human contingent arrived in force. Ships that were not the newest or the most advanced, crewed by soldiers who were not the biggest or the strongest, but who carried themselves with the same quiet, unshakable certainty that Cade carried in every step. Their armor was clean and well-maintained, standard military issue, nothing like Cade's battered relic. But every human soldier who boarded Citadel Oranath glanced at the worn armor of their senior warrant officer, with a look that I came to recognize as something beyond respect. It was faith. The particular, unshakable faith of people who have followed a man through the worst the universe can offer, and watched him walk out the other side, carrying the wounded on his back. The war against the tide would be long. It would be costly. It would test the coalition in ways that no diplomatic summit could have prepared us for. But it would not fail, because at the heart of it, wearing armor that had no right to still function, stood a man who had no right to still be alive, fighting with the calm, flat, unremarkable determination of someone who had simply never learned how to stop. I wear Valorian phase weave, the finest tactical armor my civilization produces. It gleams, it adapts, it is a masterpiece of military engineering, and I would trade it, every component, every circuit, every molecule of its advanced construction, for the certainty that I could wear it the way Elias Cade wears his armor, not as equipment, not as protection, as a promise that no matter what comes, no matter what tries to break me, I will still be standing when the silence falls. No one laughed at the worn armor again, not in the Grand Axis Hall, not in the corridors of Citadel Oranath, not on the bridges of coalition warships, not in the forward operating bases on the front lines of the Tide War. Not ever again.